Welcome to another exciting video, or willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes Video. This is a part 3 of my organisational series of videos. In this case, I've moved over to the Napoleonic Wars and will be covering the Prussian army between 1806 and 1815. I created this video, or these videos, in order to assist in my efforts in creating army lists, but the bulk of the video is a historical analysis of the TIEL, or GLIEDERUNGEN, of the Prussian army between the years of 1806 and 1815. Only the last part will cover converting this into a force mix for an actual figure gaming. I know this image here has nothing to do with the Napoleonic War, but I really do like this painting, thus I've included it as the title or the first image of my video. When creating army lists, my preferred method is to pick a battle and then use the actual force mixes available at the battle as a guide for my army list. But I decided to try to look at the issue of army lists from the other end, which is the official organisation of the force mixes rather than the actual forces involved in the battle. Using a battle force mix is useful when recreating a battle, but I wanted to look at a more generic competition-style game, army lists, where players would build up a force mix based on reasonable options which may have been historically available to them. There are many issues with this, and it's something I generally avoided in the past, but I noticed the Garde de Corps rules makes an attempt in this direction. This shows the Garde de Corps data for the Prussian army. The key values to consider here is the first number, which represents the number of units, either regiments or battalions, and the last number, which represents the number of figures within that unit, each figure representing 60 men, or at least that's what I thought it represented when I initially looked at this. This data got me rather excited until I realised it was filled with errors, which were probably required in order to fit it with the set of rules. This is one of the issues with attempting to use data in a set of rules as historical data. Obviously, in order to fit in with the rules, the designers had to manipulate the data, and that's certainly the case here. For example, the 57 line infantry regiments, shown here, each consist of 9 figures, which total 540 men, which is not correct if it's a battalion, although maybe roughly correct. But this is supposed to represent a regiment, and it's completely incorrect. The value of 57 is correct in terms of regiments, but the actual regimental strength which went to war consisted of 2 battalions, each consisting of 5 companies of 155 men. If you do the maths, you quickly discover that what you see here does not reflect the reality. On the other hand, other bits of data are quite correct. The Grenadier values are correct. There were about 28 regular Grenadier battalions, each consisting of 4 companies of 189 men, and a Garde Grenadier battalion of unknown strength. Based on this, a player could field a very unbalanced force mix with too many Grenadiers and too few line infantry. Unfortunately, my hope this data would make the job of determining the TIEL of the Prussian army easier was dashed. However, apart from this, the basic concept has merit, and I've decided to conduct a historical analysis of the Prussian army in this period, pretty much based on this data and my realisation the data had big gaps in it. A lot of the source material I'm using in this video comes from the excellent Napoleonic Armies by Ray Johnson. Another source I use is the excellent Armies of the Napoleonic Era by Otto von Pifka. This shows the English translated front cover. In my attempts to discover good source material to use for this video, I did find this. I do not possess this book, but I must admit this looks like a very interesting reference document which I will consider purchasing. I found this on Scribd, or Scribd, which is a site I have no experience with. I have to assume it's probably safe, but anyone who wishes to access this may wish to be cautious, at least initially. Quick caveat, this video is an overview of this topic and not an in-depth, historically enlightening analysis. I'm sure others possess superior knowledge and experience in this topic, but for those who wish a layman's analysis, this video is for you. Before we get into a detail or the details of the TIEL or Gliederungen of the Prussian army, I will first provide a brief overview of the different troop types which the Prussians employed, as I will be describing units based on this troop type quite a bit in this video. In the most part, these names are self-evident, but some names really are confusing and are steeped in history with a meaning lost in the long-lost past. The foot guards were line infantry, which were specially selected, trained and equipped. They may not have as much experience as a veteran formation, but they certainly had high morale and a willingness or high willingness to take risks. The high level of training would help them equal a veteran formation, and their esprit de corps would allow them to take casualties or risks no other formation would likely do so. My sources show a Garde Regiment and Garde Battalion in 1806. However, in the order of battle, the Garde Brigade consists of Fusiliers rather than any specifically named Guard formations. The 1st Foot Guard, soldier shown here, was formed in November 1806, which was after the disaster of Jean-Auerstatz. My sources indicate it was made up of surviving Foot Guard regiments. However, as there were none, I can only assume these were the 4 Fusiliers battalions in the Advanced Guard Division, which seems rather odd. I'm unsure what the origin of this formation was, but I must admit it did exist in late 1806 and may have seen some fighting before peace occurred in 1807. Grenadiers were line infantry made up of the largest and strongest men, which is fairly similar to most other armies. Being large would assist in hand-to-hand combat, thus these troops would be useful in urban fighting or as shock troops designed to break through enemy lines. They are basically heavy infantry. Apart from one battalion of Guard Grenadiers, the Grenadiers were distributed throughout all the line infantry regiments, with each containing 2 companies. When the army was to march, these were combined into 4-company Grenadier battalions, and in some cases remained in the same brigade as the parent regiment, or in other cases were concentrated elsewhere. Often regarded to as converged Grenadiers, as the formation was created by converging separate companies from other formations, in this case regiments. The line infantry were the backbone of the army, a musketeer which moved and fought in formation, while this formation, as all infantry formations, could disperse and move in an irregular manner. This was not their normal fighting mode and they generally proved ineffective as skirmishers, as the Prussians discovered in 1806 when they met the French. The reserve infantry were a type of line infantry used between 1813 and 1814. They were created to overcome the French restrictions imposed after 1807. Basically, troops would conduct some training and then would be discharged and placed back in civilian life, ready to be called up when required. Initially, they lacked recent experience and proved inferior to the more practiced regular line infantry, but by the end of 1814 they were highly experienced. In 1815 the distinction of being reserved was removed. The Landwehr or land army was made up of untrained troops or possibly older troops with some experience. The concept was not new, but the Landwehr became a people's army filled with a national patriotism in Prussia. The issue they had was a lack of equipment, training, experience. The Landwehr regiments lacked Fusiliers battalions, and as a result, they lacked skirmishers. Although special Landwehr Jager companies were formed to help overcome this issue later in the war. Some of the regiments performed very badly in 1813, but some did very well. By 1815, they were better equipped and better armed and could hold their own against standard opponents. The Fusiliers were light infantry of the line infantry regiments, capable of standard line infantry combat, but they were also trained to skirmish and act as light infantry. Each brigade normally had 2 battalions. One was split and placed on each flank, and the other formed a line in the centre front and sent its 3rd rank forward to skirmish. I'm uncertain if they were made up of smaller, younger and more robust men, as the French light regiments were, but it appears they were highly trained, as in 1806 4 of the battalions made up the Advanced Guard Division. As a result, they were almost certainly treated as fast infantry as well as skirmish-type infantry. Jagers were the skirmish troops of the Prussian army, trained to fight as skirmishers and normally deployed in company-sized formation. They could be armed with a musket or rifle, but most Jager were musket-armed or armed and trained as sharpshooters. Schutzen is a term often used to describe rifle-armed Jager. The word itself means to screen, so it's not specifically linked to the use of a rifle, but by 1815 the orders of battle normally referred to rifle-armed Jager as Schutzen. The Garde de Corps were Guard Heavy Cavalry, classed as Cuirassiers by the Prussians, although they did not wear a cuirass in 1806 and probably did not wear one at any time in the Napoleonic War. The Garde de Corps were the King's bodyguard, in theory at least. The Cuirassiers were the Prussian heavy cavalry and were made up of large men on large horses. My sources indicate they did not wear a cuirass in 1806, but did wear it between 1813 and 1815 on occasion. The cuirass was very uncomfortable to wear and the cavalrymen often avoided wearing it. However, it became clear this protection was rather useful in battle, so the more experienced troops did wear it more and more during the war. The Dragoons were the Prussian medium cavalry, classed as heavy by some. The horses were still large and the men used a straight sword designed to thrust forward. They were also equipped with a carbine and could in theory fire them from their saddle, but for the most part they were used in the same manner as the Cuirassiers. Originally a mounted infantry, I think only the French used this type of cavalry in that manner. The Hussars were light cavalry, and of all the light cavalry had the reputation of being the party animals of the army. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were armed with a sabre and were designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than forward. They were very effective in exploiting any breakthroughs and riding down fleeing enemy infantry, which is why they were often in the rear of a brigade ready to exploit such an occurrence. The Cuirassier were lance-armed Uhlans, recruited from the Polish minor nobility. As such, in 1806 they were a type of elite formation, later just called Uhlans or lance-armed light cavalry, and these later versions were probably less elite in nature, but still very highly experienced. These were lance-armed light cavalry, which could fulfill the same function as Hussars, but also had a very good anti-cavalry capacity in the form of their lance. The poor man's shock cavalry in many ways. Using a lance was not easy to do effectively, so they were rarely inexperienced soldiers. The Landwehr cavalry were light lance-armed cavalry, in the most part, raised on small horses with men which lacked a lot of training. The lance was a simple weapon to produce and could be quickly issued, but did require sufficient training to use effectively against other cavalry. On the other hand, against infantry, even inexperienced troops could be highly effective at running down fleeing enemy infantry. Some sources mention reserve cavalry, which were actually just more experienced and better trained Landwehr cavalry. They were often armed with a sabre or a carbine, as in this example, rather than a lance. When looking at the Prussian army during the period of 1806 to 1815, it can be divided into a number of basic periods. This video's main objective is to look at the structure of the Prussian army during each of these periods. While historical, I will not be covering the colour of the buttons used on the coats of specific troops. This is a pure TO&E analysis. I should also point out that the official strengths rarely reflect the actual battlefield strength. As this video will be covering official strengths and structures of the various formations, this is perhaps the main problem with using official strengths in the creation of army lists, and I suspect in the end I'll fall back on the good old-fashioned orders of battle of specific battles in order to put together my army list. However, in many cases, accurate values will not be present in these army lists or orders of battle, and knowing the official strength of a formation may assist in determining what a reasonable strength could have been during the battle. The Prussian army of 1806 possessed no permanent structure greater than a regiment. or in the case of the Fusiliers, a brigade. This shows the official formations of the Prussian army during peacetime. When an army needed to take the field, this would alter a great deal. The line regiments would split off the Grenadier companies that were within them to form Grenadier battalions, for example. The line infantry regiments also allocated its 3rd Battalion as garrison and depot battalion, which is one reason why you do not see 3-pounder guns in 1806 for the Prussians, at least in their first disastrous battle. Some of these formations were split apart, so the chasseurs de cheval were used for courier purposes, and the artillery regiments were also broken up as well and distributed among the, regiments, brigades and divisions. The Garde Infantry Regiment consisted of 3 battalions, each of 6 companies of 135 men. 2 6-pounder cannons were allocated to each battalion in time of war. The Grenadier Battalion was normally separate from this regiment and would report directly to the division it was part of. As previously mentioned, this formation was probably formed at the end of 1806 and the latter half of the 1806-07 conflict, thus was not involved in the initial debacle. This shows the entire infantry regiment during peacetime. The 3rd small battalion and the reserve company was not taken to the field and was used as garrison and depot troops. Personally, knowing I was going to fight the largest military in Europe, I would have probably taken everyone I could with me, but I understand this was done for cost containment reasons. Accountants, aren't they just wonderful? The 2 grenadier companies were split off and formed grenadier battalions, which were normally in the same infantry brigade. Each infantry battalion received a pair of 6-pounder cannons, which for battalion guns seemed rather large. These guns were heavy and would not be able to keep up with the infantry while being man-handled, but I would expect it would be useful in defence. The Fusiliers and Jagers were distributed to each of the divisions under the light brigades, although the Prussians also used the Fusiliers in their advanced guard division. There were 27 battalions of these light troops, which were distributed across the 14 divisions. While the Fusiliers would have been capable as skirmishers, in 1806 these formations were mainly used as fast infantry, which indicates they were manned by young and robust mobile men, which could march or run quickly over great distance. The 14 divisions raised in 1806 required 28 regiments of heavy and medium cavalry, of which the Prussians possessed 27 regiments, excluding the Garde de Corps. The Garde de Corps regiment was part of the Guards. Most of the light cavalry were allocated to the 14 divisions. The Prussians did have a battalion formation in the light regiment, each of which consisted of 5 squadrons. This special cavalry battalion structure disappeared after 1807. The final part of the puzzle is the artillery formations, which were normally kept at brigade level in peacetime and allocated out as required during the war. The howitzers were not fielded, again, for economic reasons. Those damn accountants, once again. Now we'll come to the wartime army. When Prussia went to war in 1806, it organised its field armies into divisions, which were not formal structures with permanent officers in place during peacetime. A typical division, of which there were 14, consisted of 3 infantry brigades, 1 cavalry brigade, and a light brigade. The infantry brigade consisted of 2 regiments, a grenadier battalion, and a foot artillery battery. The foot artillery battery was obviously allocated from the artillery regiments, and the grenadier battalion was formed by taking the 2 grenadier companies from each of the 2 regiments and creating an individual grenadier battalion. The cavalry brigade consisted of 2 heavy or medium cavalry regiments, each of which consisted of 5 squadrons, and a horse artillery battery. Just a note, I use the battalion symbol for cavalry squadrons in this videos, as the battalion represents the basic building block of any army and is the US convention. The British would use a company symbol in this case. The Prussians did actually have cavalry battalions in 1806 to 1807, which consisted of 5 squadrons and reported to a regiment. When by itself it was called a regiment. or if heavy cavalry, and in some case medium cavalry. This was all rather confusing, but it was the situation in 1806 to 1817. The cavalry, that is the cavalry brigade, would be a mix of Cuirassiers and Dragoons. The light brigade consisted of a Fusilier or Jager battalion and a light cavalry regiment. For the most part, the light cavalry would be Hussars, but it's possible some could be Polish Uhlans as well. Incidentally, the light cavalry was organised with cavalry battalions, as you can see here. So there were 10 squadrons in each regiment, unlike the standard cavalry regiments that you would find in the cavalry brigade. This shows the actual orders of battle of the 1st and 2nd Division at Jena Osterdet. If anything, the numbers here are greater than the official structure would indicate, which is not surprising as the numbers I used were based on companies only. Additional troops would be present at regimental, brigade and divisional level. One point I do find puzzling is the mention of 4-pounder horse artillery batteries, which I was not aware the Prussians possessed. The same applies to the 9-pounder foot artillery batteries. One of my two sources must be in error, something I'll need to investigate in more detail. Just another note, this army was actually an army that was marching out for battle for the first time. As a result, the possibility that the strengths of the wartime formations were very close to the official strengths was very high. You'll see later in 1813 to 14, when the formations had been in battle for quite a while, the strengths differs very wildly between reality and theoretical strengths. The most significant dividing line in the Prussian army is between 1807 and 1808. The Prussian army of 1806 to 7 was basically dismantled, reorganised and rebuilt from the ground up between 1808 and 1813. This ground-up reorganisation was one reason why the army was so resilient in the 1813-15 period, considering its low numbers, poor equipment and rapid expansion. Many of the reforms which made the greatest difference were generally invisible, such as the general staff structure. These changes will not be covered in this video, as the main focus here is the actual physical structure of the army. 1808 was the year of rapid reorganisation, and we'll pass that and go to the final structure of the 1809 Prussian army. The brigades were becoming a semi-permanent structure, and this image shows the Garde Brigade on the left and the 5 standard brigades on the right. However, this was not the structure which would be used when going to war. Actually, when Prussia did go to war in 1813, this changed dramatically. This shows the typical corps structure as envisaged by the Prussians in 1809. The Prussians did not possess 10 infantry brigades, so obviously the structure assumed mass mobilisation of the reserve regiments. Initially, only 1 brigade would be available per so-called corps. When you look at the cavalry strength, this was also obvious. The pre-planned strength was what allowed the Prussians to mobilise such a large force in such a small period of time in 1813. And while it was not perfect, it was impressive in its execution. Obviously, the only corps which was raised was the one sent to Russia during Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, although it was not very large and was called an auxiliary corps, consisting of 16,000 to 20,000 men only. If we look at the infantry regiment, there were significant changes here, with the Fusiliers now being allocated to the regiment. In 1806, the lack of light infantry, or to be specific, skirmishers, where and when they were needed was a major part of the poor showing of the Prussians in the 1806 to 1807 war, and that mistake was never going to occur again as far as the Prussians were concerned. The next biggest evolution or change in the Prussian army was the period between 1812 and 1813. While during the 1808 to 1812 period the main focus was reorganising and rebuilding the army, with a boost occurring in 1812 due to Napoleon's invasion of Russia, it was the raising of the reserve and Landwehr regiments in 1813 which was the rising of the Prussian phoenix, so to speak. Many short-term experiments were attempted, the Freikorps being the most colourful, but the whole wide-ranging raising of the Landwehr were possibly the most significant experiment that was executed from 1813 onwards. This shows the basic building blocks of the Prussian army after mobilisation in 1813. This took time to accomplish, and it was not until late in 1813 that the Prussians had effective operational forces in the field which did not require Russian support and assistance. The key point was the 12 reserve regiments were manned by troops previously trained up and demobilised. As their training was either basic or the troops were rather rusty, they did not perform as well as the regulars, but by 1814 were performing adequately, or at least almost as good as the regulars. The other significant point is the Landwehr. They were truly unprepared troops and their numbers were massive. In some cases they performed very badly, in others they did reasonably or unexpectedly well. It would take a lot longer for the Landwehr to gain anywhere near the proficiency required to match the reserves, much less the regulars, but they certainly had enthusiasm. The Prussians mitigated this by mixing the Landwehr with regular and reserve troops. This combination was not perfect, but it worked and gave the Prussians 4 large corps in 1813, or at least 3 very effective corps and 1 less effective corps. The Prussians sent their guard formations to join the Russian guards. This structure is the peacetime structure. The cavalry brigade consisted of between 2 and 3 cavalry regiments, and each of which consisted of 4 squadrons. This was another significant change between 1807 and 1809. The strength of the regiments went down from 5 squadrons to 4, and the strength of each squadron was actually reduced, and the whole battalion or cavalry battalion structure was removed. The artillery brigade consisted of 3 12-pounder, 6 6-pounder and 3 6-pounder horse artillery batteries. There was a single howitzer battery, but I'm certain where it was actually allocated. Now we come to the actual wartime structure. The 1813 Corps was large, with 4 infantry brigades, between 1 and 2 cavalry brigades and an artillery brigade. The 4th Corps was made up entirely of Landwehr and reserves and was not as effective as the first 3 corps. When we drill down into the actual corps, the infantry brigade consists of a regular reserve and Landwehr regiment. As indicated earlier, this is an attempt to try and mitigate the lack of skill of the Landwehr and assist everyone to sort of ramp up. The line, actually in many ways, even though most army lists show the line as standard trained, these were the cream de creme of the Prussian army and probably were considered, or should be considered, veteran. Reserves probably should be considered trained, and Landwehr obviously raw or militia. But anyway, that's my personal opinion. In addition, there was either a single Grenadier battalion or 2 Jager companies attached. The cavalry support came in the form of a line or Landwehr light cavalry regiment, and an artillery battery was attached as well. The cavalry brigade consisted of between 2 and 3 cavalry regiments, which in turn were made up of 4 squadrons of cavalry each. The cavalry was a mix of regular, reserve and Landwehr cavalry. Each corps required a total of between 6 and 10 cavalry regiments, requiring up to 40 cavalry regiments for all the corps. As there were only 22 regular and 5 reserve cavalry regiments, the gaps were filled with Landwehr cavalry. The artillery brigade consists of 3 heavy, 6 medium, foot artillery and 3 horse artillery batteries. As the Prussians only had 50 batteries in total, this possibly represents an ideal strength, with the actual strength being much less. The 3rd Corps at Leipzig only had 2 12-pounder, 1 6-pounder and 1 horse artillery battery in their reserve, although it had an additional 3 6-pounder and 2 6-pounder horse artillery batteries with other formations in the same corps. The artillery obviously was allocated out to the infantry brigades and cavalry brigades from this formation. So in this particular case, what you see is a double counting of the batteries. As we can see from this actual order of battle of the Prussian 3rd Corps at Leipzig, 16th-18th October 1813, the reality was kind of different from theory, particularly in strength. The Prussians had been fighting for many months and were in the process of a rapid mobilisation, so this can be expected. If you look at the total strengths in terms of manpower, these generally were a lot less than the ideal structure, but it was certainly ramping up. Of that there is no doubt. Let's now drill down into more detail into the brigades. The infantry brigade consisted of 3 infantry regiments, a Grenadier battalion, or in some cases 2 Jager companies, cavalry regiment and artillery battery. This was reasonably large for a brigade. The regular and reserve regiments were organised in a similar manner, each possessing Fusiliers and Grenadiers. The Grenadier companies were merged and formed a Grenadier battalion, in theory. However, most orders of battle do not include these formations, such as with the 3rd Corps shown previously. In most cases, Jager companies were present. I'm uncertain where the Grenadiers went. My guess is that they may have been concentrated with the Guards. If we look at the Landwehr regiment in more detail, it lacked any Fusiliers or Grenadiers. As a result, it possessed very poor skirmishing capability and required support from Jager companies. Later in the war, the Landwehr raised specific Jager detachments which were allocated to the Landwehr regiments, I assume, semi-permanently. As indicated, I assume that in most cases, companies of Jager or Schutzen were attached to the brigade rather than a Grenadier battalion. Due to the lack of effective organic skirmishing in the Landwehr, this was probably a critical requirement and probably more useful than having Grenadiers at this particular point. Each cavalry brigade contains 4 squadrons of cavalry, which was an integral part of a brigade attack formation. These were normally placed in the rear of the attack column on either side of the artillery. The artillery was normally placed in the centre at the rear. To the front of the artillery, only a line of Fusiliers were deployed. Thus, I assume if the Fusiliers were cleared away by enemy counterattacks, that force would face cannon fire and hostile horse battalions on each flank. The 5th Brigade at Leipzig, 1618, October 1813, was a very close to an ideal structure. It consisted of 7,760 men and 8 guns, and in this order of battle we can see the Grenadier Battalion. The cavalry consisted of Line Hussars and Ulan regiments. The last dividing line was the boundary between 1814 and 1815. This was probably the least significant evolution or change, and actually represents more of a slow filling out and evolution of what was really started in 1813. The Prussian army, after the experience of 1813-14, had created its winning formula, and in 1815 it was all about building on these foundations. This shows the Prussian peacetime army in 1815. The only main area of change here was that there were a lot more formations all over the place. As we'll discover later, one of the things that occurred was that the reserve regiments were merged into the regular regiments and expanded accordingly. We'll drill down into the Infantry Brigade. As you can see here, there are no reserve regiments. They were now considered part of the regular regiment structure, and this represented possibly the biggest real change, or at least on paper, in the Prussian army. The Landwehr normally consisted of 3 battalion regiments rather than 4, or at least all the orders of battles I could find indicate this, but I assume some were 4 in some cases. During the Waterloo campaign, I could not find any Grenadier battalions in any of the order of battle, but many brigades had Schutzen and Jager attached instead, the 1st Brigade having 2 companies attached, and many other brigades also. Some had nothing attached in this area. Again, I'm not quite sure where the Grenadiers went, but I do know that the Garde de Corps was being formed in Berlin or somewhere like that, so my gut feeling is that's where they were all being concentrated. Again, looking at the order of battle of the Prussian army during the Waterloo campaign, most of the brigades did not have any cavalry attached directly. The 1st Brigade had a Hussar regiment, but most of its squadrons were not present when this formation met the French. This shows the 1st Infantry Brigade, which is part of the 1st Corps. The artillery was attached to this brigade from Corps Artillery Brigade, and you can see there were 2 companies of Schutzen, as well as attached Jager and the Landwehr regiment. Looking at the order of battle of the Prussian army during the Waterloo campaign, 2 Corps has 2 cavalry brigades, and the other 2 Corps had 3 cavalry brigades each. So I assume the cavalry was being concentrated into the cavalry brigades rather than distributed out to the infantry brigades. The 1st Corps possessing 2 cavalry brigades of 4 and 3 regiments each. The cavalry was growing in numbers and strength as compared with 1813-14, where it was comparatively weak for the Prussians. This is a drill down of the 1st Corps, which consisted of the 1st and 2nd Cavalry Brigade. The 1st Brigade consisted of 4 cavalry regiments, all of which were line regiments. The 2nd was mainly made up of Landwehr cavalry. All the artillery within the Corps came from the artillery battery and there were 4 6-pounder batteries allocated to the 4 infantry brigades, 1 per brigade. This source also shows a single 8-pounder battery, perhaps captured of the French in the previous war, or previous years. 1 horse artillery battery was allocated to each of the cavalry brigades, with the 1st Corps only possessing 3 horse artillery batteries, so there was 1 battery left over. This shows only the artillery reserve of the 1st Corps. The Corps contained the howitzer battery. There were 3 horse artillery batteries, which I find a bit surprising. I mean, there were only 2 cavalry brigades, but maybe that was just simply the way it was moving. I'm uncertain if any of the foot artillery consisted of 8-pounders, as this order of battle does not indicate artillery type. Now we come to the creating army list, that is taking the historical data we've assembled so far and creating it into something that looks like a force mix for a game of rules. For those not interested in actual figure gaming, then the video from this point on is probably not what you'd be particularly interested in. For those interested in figure gaming, then this section from here on attempts to convert all the data, as I've indicated before, into something that you could create a force mix with. No specific set of rules are being modelled here. Instead, I will model based on figure scale, starting with a typical 50 men per infantry figure scale. For higher scales, such as 100 men per figure, you simply halve the number of elements, and so on. In order to convert the TIE into a force mix for a game, we need to use one of the magic scale ratios. This is one example, and in this example, all the elements would occupy a similar frontage. For example, at 50 men per figure and 4 figures per element or base, the frontage would be about 40 metres in line. The same applies with cavalry and artillery, although it must be pointed out there is obviously some variability. For example, artillery, the British preferred greater separation between guns and the French a bit less. The values I've got here sit somewhere in between. I'll use these ratios for my force mixes. If playing a higher scale game, simply multiply these values by whatever that higher scale is, 2, 3 or more. Thus, a set of rules where an infantry element represents 1,000 men, the infantry scale is 5 times what is shown here. The artillery element, in this case, would represent 20 guns. Clearly, this is not divisible by most artillery battery strengths, but gives us a starting point from which players can take whatever, from this starting point and do whatever fine-tuning they so desire. We'll start with the infantry division, 1806 to 1807. Using the principle of always rounding down and staying with whole elements, we end up with an infantry regiment consisting of 6 infantry elements and an element of artillery. The Grenadier battalion consists of 3 elements of 4 figures and 1 artillery element. In this case, we are using the leftover guns from the regiment to fill out the Grenadier artillery. Finally, we have 2 elements of 6-pounders. This is a total of 20 elements. Now we'll look at the Cavalry Brigade for the 1806 to 1807 force mix. This consists, or the Division Cavalry Brigade consists of 2 cavalry regiments. I'm showing you here a Dragoon and Cuirassier. The regiments consist of 9 elements. Each element has 2 figures on it. Each figure is 40 cavalry. This represents our 40-metre frontage. In addition, there is also a 6-pounder horse artillery element, which represents on average 4 guns. The total here is, again, 20 elements. The light cavalry consists of a single light cavalry regiment, which consists of 18 elements, and 4 elements of Jager in skirmish mode in this particular case, which means there are 2 figures per element. If we total all the elements together, we now have our Prussian division of 64 elements, which is about the most a player could field in a game which would be expected to end in a 4 to 6 hour period. This makes a good force mix for a set of rules such as WRG, Garde de Corps, or any other similar set of scaled rules where the player is expected to command no more than a single corps. That is a French corps, which is much smaller than a Prussian corps. One observation is we do have a lot of artillery and cavalry in this force mix, more than I would have expected. This could be due to the use of 2 cavalry per element basing, but we are dealing with troops which basically occupy the same frontage, and that's what the answer is. Some sources claim a horse has a frontage of 1 pace rather than 1 metre. If this is correct, then basing the cavalry through to a base may be optional, but most reasonable sources indicate that 1 metre per horse was the actual frontage of cavalry when 2 lines were close to meeting. So I will stay with that particular frontage. This is an interesting observation with Napoleonic battles. In the early period there was normally a lot more cavalry, and clearly with some armies a lot more artillery. This was certainly not the case in 1813-15. Now we'll go to 1813 to 14, and in this case we'll be modelling an infantry brigade. Just remember, the Prussians had big formations. If this was French, I would probably be modelling a French corps rather than the French, let's say, division. Anyway, the Prussian brigade. This represents our infantry brigade. Each group of 4 elements represents a battalion. At 47 elements, this is probably the most you would want to field in a typical game. There is no way you could field an entire corps and expect to have a game which can last in a single day. If you adopt an infantry figure scale of 1 in 200, then this force mix would represent all 4 brigades of a corps. You would then need to add the cavalry brigade and reserve artillery, which would add, let's say, 5 to 10 extra cavalry elements, 2 horse artillery elements, and let's say 2 12-pounder foot artillery elements, which is a reasonably large force mix, but is feasible for a typical game. So at a scale of 1 in 200, you could certainly duplicate a Prussian corps, but at a scale of 50 to 1, all I would attempt to field is a single brigade. We'll now move to 1815. The 1815 brigade would be a similar size and composition to the 1813-14 brigade. The real difference is if we move to a corps formation using a scale of 200 to 1. In that case, expect more cavalry. Obviously the morale and quality of the troops would be superior as well, but that's not what we'll be covering in this video. Just one slight modification. As we saw, quite a few of the infantry brigades did not have any cavalry, so you could possibly consider not having the cavalry, but if you wanted to have a game with this, I probably wouldn't go down that particular path. Let's come back to the Garde de Corps data. This shows the data for Prussia corrected by myself with the research I've done so far. If we look at the line regiment 0608 entry, this means there are 57 units, each unit consisting of 24 figures of line infantry, each figure representing 60 men. The figure scale for those rules is 1 in 60, that's why I use the 1 in 60. The 5D is the melee grade and morale grade, the A and B being Guard or Elite, C being Veteran, so on. In this case, the morale grade is D, which means it's average or standard regular troops. Garde de Corps uses different descriptions, so what I'm using is my generic interpretations, which may be more meaningful. The 5 is its melee grade, with a 5 sitting around the centre of the range, which goes from 1 to 10. As you can see, the Grenadiers at 9 are much better in melee, with the Hussars being the standout at 10. I have no comments on the accuracy of these values, and they are dependent on the game system, but I find it interesting seeing what other people's opinion of such a difficult to pin down bit of data or comparison is like. And so part 3 of my organisational video series comes to a close, in this case covering the Prussian army between the years of 1806 and 1815. When I get a chance, I will be posting all these charts and tables in my Kriegsspiel.io group site, shown here. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hilfe zu kämpfen.